Hey, welcome everybody who's joining us, and everybody who might be watching later on YouTube to the ShowZ Store Discord server. We have an event this evening, which is going to be run by who we have nicknamed the Chief Engineer Mech, JUNKMECH. He's going to be doing a weathering workshop. So we're going to be checking out some weathering skills, and if anybody has questions, you can always ask them in the chat box that's made off of Swerve's Bar and Grill. So with that, I will toss it over to Chief Engineer Mac Junkmac. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the intro. So today we'll go over some basic weathering stuff. This is going to be a two-parter. It would be unreasonably long if we tried to squeeze everything I want into one video or one stream in general. So this is going to be a two-parter. Today we're going to go over dry brushing, which, let me grab an example. We'll get you something like this. If you look at the stuff like the arms, this is there's some more to this than just dry brushing, but it gets you a lot of the look. In fact, where is Parakill? This guy here I only dry brushed him. Really, I should probably go back and do some more. Maybe I'll use him for the subject of the next stream. But this guy is just dry brushed. All of the silver on the whole figure is all done with dry brushing. It's a pretty user-friendly technique. As long as you do it correctly, like you kind of can't mess it up fundamentally, and then the biggest mistake you can make is not having moderation. This is one of those things where you can very easily overdo it. I've done it plenty, where you just go super hard on it and then you kind of ruin your look if that's what you weren't going for. But yeah, we'll go over some dry brushing today. For subjects, I'm probably just going to be going over Perukill's weapons because I have not gotten around to touching those up yet. And since Parakill himself is only dry brushed, we'll only dry brush these two just to kind of get it all in order. But first, what we're going to start with is tools. Dry brushing is one of the big selling points of it is that it doesn't need much. You really only need a paint or two or three. Really, I'd say two. Two paints of your choice, one brush or two brushes. The thing with these is dry brushing is really hard on brushes, so you want to have a couple that you dedicate only to dry brushing with the expectation that you won't really be able to use them for anything else. I bought a big pack on Amazon a while back. Fire in Me, apparently. And these have been serving me pretty well. This is my main brush. It's just a square head standard brush, super cheap. I didn't spend a lot of money on these or anything, knowing that I would ruin them. And I basically do all of it with all my dry brushing lately with just this one singular brush. It's kind of all you need. Just one appropriate brush. You don't want to go too fine for general dry brushing or else it won't look natural, especially when you're working with like masterpiece size transformers or 8 to 10 inch toys. Anything smaller than this will kind of get you an unrealistic look, and anything bigger will have the same effect where it's just too big. So a nice medium-sized brush, and then to start you need paper towel. I've used this one some. I actually kept one just for this. Here's one that I used last dry brushing session, where this is all just paint that I wiped off. You normally only need one sheet. And then here's the paint I'll be using. It is Tamiya Chrome Silver. It's my go-to one on darker colors like this. It really just pops better than anything else. I also have to hand Gunmetal by Tamiya, as well as Titanium Silver. However, I'm not going to use this one. And Gunmetal, I'm only going to be using this in a few spots, namely anywhere that's darker, because this won't really show up on the lighter color. And then we also have the hook, which will also get a once over. And I mean, yeah, it's not too hard to start. Dry brushing is super easy to start with. Like I said, here is your starter pack. Just this. This is all you need. And yeah, I guess we'll kind of just launch right into it. So here's our subject. Here's our brush. I'm going to shake my paint up. The one thing with Tamiya acrylics, or metallics rather, This is all acrylic, but the thing with these that does need to be noted, they separate really bad if left to sit. The metallic will all gather at the bottom into this big, thick clump, and then it kind of becomes unusable. It definitely ruins itself if left to sit too long. Here's one of my paint mixing chopsticks that I use, and you can see up here at the end it's bulbous. That was from me trying to save my old pot of chrome silver. You get all this thick stuff at the bottom, and well, you could probably get it to reintegrate somehow. I am not privy to how to do that, but yeah. So there we go. Paint's all good to go. Just gonna throw that over here. All right. So to start, let's see. I think we'll start back here on these braces, I suppose. I don't really know the term. So as far as how we actually go about starting the process, you just take your brush, dip it in, and then you want to wipe as much as you can off. The reason it's called dry brushing is because of the core conceit of the technique, where you wipe as much as you can off, and then you just take your paper towel and you wipe it off. You basically want to get it to the point where if you wipe gently, it doesn't leave anything behind. If it's too wet, it'll just completely smear the thing in paint, and then it won't have the look that you're going for. And if you have too little, you don't have enough paint. So I think we should be pretty good. Let's give this a quick try. Check. Yep, that's about right. So let me get this zoomed in a little. Ooh, a little too much. There we go. So as far as the actual technique goes, it's really simple. With so little paint, it doesn't really slop onto stuff. And what I like to do is I go along the sides like this in a technique called edge highlighting, where you use the paint in the brush just to wipe along the edges at an angle like this. And then it highlights the edge of the plastic because of the thickening paint of silver. The way dry brushing really works is anything raised will automatically kind of do it. I wonder if I can show on this real quick. Not really. There's so little paint in this. But that's basically what you want. You want as little as possible. And then you're just going to wipe it right on. It can be kind of time consuming. This is not a super fast process. I normally do it in sessions. I'll paint for an hour or so and call it good there. But so you can already see an immediate difference between our unpainted section and our painted one. Let me get the light just a little closer. There you go. See? So it doesn't take much. The chief thing you have to worry about, as I've said, is making sure that you are not going too overboard, because it just too much starts to look a little ridiculous. It kind of ruins the effect a little. But I mean, it's a fine balancing act. And the actual process of applying the paint is, like I said, super straightforward. Let's see, I'm gonna go ahead and lather it onto the bolts. When I'm doing these, I like to imagine while looking at it what would cause pieces to wear and tear. For example, like joints are always going to have a lot more wear than like a straight panel, or like the feet will always have a lot more wear than the rest of the legs, stuff like that. It's not required, but it is just one of those little things I prefer to do. And then, yeah, I mean, the actual act of dry brushing is super straightforward. You just brush it on. And I'll do a little more in-depth stuff in a little bit once we have a base down. But you want to define the edges first before you start going in and doing anything else, because it creates the most believable look. Edges always see the most weathering as compared to the center of a panel. Honestly, this is one of those things where having a reference can help a lot. And like in my spare time, I'll like walk around and try to walk by construction areas and stuff, because in real life, the only things that really see much weathering are construction equipment. An excavator, for example, will be a great visual reference just to kind of show you what to expect. But yeah, ultimately it's super straightforward. There's a little bit of technique involved, especially compared to something like airbrushing, where you just kind of brush it on with the airbrush, but it comes pretty easily with time and does not really demand too much. As long as you have the right kind of brush, the right kind of paint, and you're approaching it with the right mindset, you can very easily dry brush a figure. A pretty common mistake is not taking your time. This is the kind of thing where it can't really be rushed, in my opinion. Like, I'm going fairly quickly through here, but this is gonna need at least one more pass to really get the look that I would like from it. And I'm only edge highlighting right now. Right now, edge highlighting right now, just because it's kind of my favorite part. I like the effect that it has a lot. I also will go through while doing this and touch up things like bolts or sprues, marks, or anything like that. That is molded in, of course. If it's like a production error, then I would just trim that off. But yeah, I mean, pretty straightforward. Like on this panel here, for example, it's kind of a large flat area, so I will specifically go in and brush in some plate detail along the flat part, just because it helps break up the large generic panel, gives it a little more depth, like that. Honestly, the bottom is probably where you should focus it the most. Here we go. Pretty straightforward, and again, it makes a pretty major difference without too much work. You really see a big change when you're just adding a little bit at a time. There we go. So what I would say with another color, if you really want to go extravagant on this kind of thing, which isn't normally really all that necessary, all you have to do is go in and add another layer of dry brushing over the top in a darker color. What that does is it blends it in and kind of adds a layer of subtlety to it, which is great if that's a look that you want. But I've found that, at least when I've shown my work like this to lay people, people not in the fandom or not really into toys or anything, I find that if I go more subtle, people don't notice it. They don't know what they're looking for and therefore do not see it. And that's fine, but like if I show it to my wife, I'd like my wife to be able to go, oh wow, that's cool. And then if you have a little more paint on your brush, multiple passes will get you these whole raised sections highlighted like that without really touching the areas in between. It's a pro and a con of dry brushing, where you see things naturally edge highlight, but then it can be hard to get the inside of panels done correctly. And normally what you just have to do is go in and with a slightly wetter brush and just drop it in there. Like we'll do that here in this little gap here, just by way of example. And again, I am not using much paint. Like you dip your full brush in there, and then I just wipe it off. Like you want to get as much back in your pot as possible, because otherwise you're just wasting paint for no reason. And of course, everything's getting more expensive, so. And then, yeah, you just wipe it off. See, so it starts really, really obvious, and then as you taper it down, you start to not really see as much. But I want to leave a good bit on there, especially in the ends of the brush, which you can control exactly which parts you wipe off with a little practice. But then we can go in that and pick out the detent of that panel with a little paint. It's not quite the same as just putting a pure wet brush in there. You still get a little bit of the kind of the token dry brushed look, which is good if you like it. If you don't, then we'll have to figure out another way for you to weather your toys. But yeah, I mean those are the basics. It's super straightforward. It's mostly just a matter of getting the brush technique right, especially if you're not comfortable painting, which really only can come with time and practice. I would recommend dry brushing on a cheap toy before you start in on your I don't know, $200 King of Cavaliers or something. Jumping on the deep end is a thing you can do. It's what I did, but at the same time, I would not necessarily recommend it, because if you do a bad job, then you won't be satisfied with your work, and then you feel like you ruined your toy, which always feels bad. Of course, the nice thing with this specific kind of paint, like Tamiya, is it is water-based. So if you were to, say, do a really bad job, or you just weren't satisfied with it, you could wet this, like put it in the sink, and then just use a dry paper towel and wipe it off and scrub a little bit, and it'll come right up. It's pretty easy to remove if you want to. And in fact, in the second part of this, when we do dirt washes, you have to be careful if you don't seal this with a top coat first, or else you'll accidentally rub your dry brushing right off, which I did do a bit when I was doing the monkey here. I wonder if I can show you. So right here on the leg panel, I actually went a little too hard scrubbing my dirt wash off, and I peeled a lot of my dry brushing off. Just touch that up real quick. There. Cool. Yeah, it's one of these things. This is very mutable. You can kind of shrink it down or scale it up as much as you want. You could do this to any toy too. I just find that with these sort of bright silver paints that I like to use, they look best over dark, because anything light, you won't see the contrast as much. But yeah, I mean, that's the basics. Badger, do you have anything you want to chime in with? Any questions? Anything you want me to clarify while I'm kind of going about doing this?
Yeah, so like, is there? You mentioned that it could be easy to remove it, especially with water. If, let's say, someone wants to get started with this and they don't know when they're going to have the capability to come back and add a wash, should they be worried that their dry brushing is going to come off over time?
Yes and no. If you don't seal it with a top coat, which I have one right here, perfect. So here's a top coat. Do not spray these indoors, by the way. I have this indoors because I was storing it. But this is just an aerosol Mr. Hobby dry top coat. But if you don't put a top coat on it, it is possible to scrape this stuff off. But it doesn't, like, I didn't seal this. This monkey guy is not top coated at all. Truthfully, I just didn't really care. And it won't just come right off. Like, see, it definitely will linger pretty well. But if you put it on like a really high movement area, like a transformation joint, it is entirely possible, if you don't top coat it, that you'll start scraping little pieces of your dry brushing off. But on the plus side, if you don't seal it and then you transform it once, it tells you what areas are so high friction that top coating it could create issues, because top coating adds a layer that is noticeably thicker than most like dry brushing paint, and can therefore increase friction and tightness on stuff, which, on some stuff that could be a problem. If you dry brush a peg, for example, and then it gets so tight that you can no longer peg it in, or it pegs in and then you can't unpeg it, and then you shear the peg or something. That's the one thing, is like a lot of the stuff that I dry brush either has a very simple transformation, or I don't really care to transform it. There are exceptions, of course, but you have to be mindful of how a layer of paint will impact a figure, both functionally and also like how the figure is going to impact your layer of paint. And yeah, that's a great question. It can definitely rub off. And like if you take it out in the rain or something and then you like handle it while it's still wet, you'll rub a ton of that stuff off if you haven't sealed it. Top coating is recommended, but also you have to use a kind of a weather hand on it. You don't want to be top coating too thick, or you'll ruin the look of the paint and make it impossible to transform your toy. So that actually might need its own little highlight video or something at some point, because there's a little bit of finesse involved in top coating transforming toys. But I'd say for like if you're doing it to a gun, I'm not going to top coat this. No way. It doesn't matter. I will not handle this so much that the paint will come off. Like, let's see. Can I get this to rub off now? A little. But like it's, it sticks on there all right. I would just be mindful of how you choose to handle a figure that you have dry brushed, specifically because, eventually if you handle it constantly, like if it's your favorite toy and you dry brush it without sealing it, it is entirely possible that you will, rub a lot of that off and take a lot of that look away. But at the same time, it's easy to fix. You just rub it right back on.
You could like check out how you might like it with a figure by doing it on some accessories.
Yeah, that's true. And like check your paint against the color of plastic. Like if the gun is the same color as the body, you can see how your chosen paint will look on a chosen plastic color. And also, one thing to note with this, like, I know from experience with this specific plastic that paint adheres to it pretty well, because I already did a full dry brush job on Perukill himself. But some plastic does not respond as well. The mythical unpaintable plastic is a great example where stuff just doesn't stick that well. Like, let's grab that monkey again. He's a great example because I just did him. So his thighs, let's focus this. There we go. They're a lighter plastic, but also like something about the composition of this specific plastic. It has a little bit of like a metallic weave in it or something. I don't know what you'd exactly call it. It looks cheap because this is cheap, but this plastic, for example, doesn't really take to paint all that well. Like, you can get it there, but it was definitely a struggle to get it to a point where it adhered enough to look decent. And there are methods of taking care of that. You could give it a pass with rubbing alcohol or something to make the plastic more porous, but like in my case that's like a $25 monkey toy. I'm not gonna spend the time to do anything more than just the basics on it because it kind of doesn't justify it. But yeah, it's totally valid to practice on accessory. I mean, honestly, practicing on an accessory is probably the best way to go, because you can easily stick a plastic gun or something in your sink and just wash the paint right off. You use a little soap, like dish soap or something, it comes right off. So, well, specifically if you're using, water-based acrylic paint, which I recommend, especially since, I do this in my apartment spare bedroom, and I want to be able to like hang out in here and play computer games and stuff, and I don't want to be using something like enamel because that stuff is pretty toxic.
Hey,
But yeah, definitely a valid choice to practice on accessories. I think that would be recommended if it's your first time. Pull out a gun and give it a couple passes, give it a shot, see how you like it.
hey, what about like if your figure is painted or not painted? Is there anything that you should worry about like messing up a deco?
I mean, if you're going to be putting it on and then washing it back off, I would not recommend doing it over paint. I've done this stuff like directly over paint a decent amount. I avoided most of the painted areas on Perukill. Right, he has a lot of like little painted details and stuff that are picked out. But I did do it on other sections, right? And you're not gonna hurt the factory paint. These are like industrial enamels or something, and they don't come off very easily. Like, you have to want them to come off. But if you soaked it in soap and water, and then we're scrubbing it off, you could very easily rip paint off of a toy. I would not see that as impossible, but at the same time, like, you'd have to be scrubbing pretty hard. Like, you don't need that much force, but it's possible. It's definitely possible. If it's not painted, there's nothing you can do to damage it. You're not going to hurt it. Even if you put it on and take it off a couple times, like, you're fine. The only thing I would say is don't use Tamiya flat paint, like this flat black, on something that you plan on taking back off. If you want to be able to remove it, something about flat paint. The reason I have such a large pot of this, I use this as primer. It is my primary paint priming paint. I don't even use regular primer anymore. I just use flat black. But if you wash that off, it stains plastic and stuff. Something about the chemical composition, just it's there to stay. It's not coming back off. But the metallics, no problem. You might have some sparkles or like little bits of metallic fleck left over after you wash it off. But all things considered, that's not too bad. For something where you painted it and then unpainted it, that's not bad at all. And I think if you wash it a couple times, you can get any lingering sparkle off if you really want to. There we go. So this is coming together. Let me get this focused, and then I'll flip it over just to kind of give you an idea of how different of a look you start to get. And again, like you can do this more or less than I do. The nice thing about stuff like dry brushing is there's not really any absolute to it. I have a very specific preference that I've developed over doing this for way too long. I think I've been painting model kits like this for like 7 or 8 years. So, I have a very deep set specific preference for how I do these sort of things. And I tend to favor kind of more over less. But you could totally do just some light edge highlighting, which I will do again here in a little bit, just so that way you have a little bit more pop to your plastic. Like if you wanted to just go in here and do like edge highlighting along the top of the barrel, maybe drag it down just a little. Like that, like that's fairly subtle. And you could do that across the whole figure and you would have a pretty subtle sort of dynamic look to it. But this is a Baver's toy, like those things are made out of junk and scrap metal, so it's fine. It's fine that I go overboard in this case. I've justified it to myself. And ultimately, this is one of those things where you can do as much or as little as you want because there's no way to do this wrong. Like dry brushing, you fundamentally won't be doing dry brushing if you don't wipe your brush off enough. But other than that, like, I mean, you literally can't do it wrong. And it's so user-friendly and intuitive to just throw some on there. It takes almost nothing at all. Normally with this specific paint, I do a second pass after it's fully dried because I find that it tends to lose a lot of luster. It gets dull after it's dried a bit, like it's not quite so shiny, which is nice in its own way, but for stuff like edge highlighting, I find that it looks best when you have a really shiny edge as compared to having a slightly more bland, kind of more realistic looking metal edge. But yeah, lots of room to experiment with this sort of thing. And of course, you don't have to just do it in metallics. On the monkey that I keep showing off, on the thighs specifically, I actually dry brushed some flat black, this stuff, onto the thighs first to give myself a base for the shiny silver to sit on top of. If you specifically want like the shiny silver dry brushed look like this, then adding a black or a dark base color underneath it first, which you can also dry brush on, is a pretty easy way to make it stand out a little, especially if you're pretty subtle with the dark part. Then you get a nice little bit of dark popping through under the silver, which in my opinion kind of results in a pretty realistic sort of look. But it's one of those things where you can absolutely approach this in a lot of ways. And then while you're doing this kind of thing, you need to make sure you keep, again, this is advice specifically for like metallic Tamiya paint, but you need to make sure you keep it fairly stirred up or all that metallic fleck will just kind of sink to the bottom. But easily rectified. And you'll notice because the texture of the paint will kind of thin out a little as the heavier aspect, like elements of the paint will separate down to the bottom. And you can just kind of tell looking at it that it's a little runnier than it should be. There we go. So yeah, like just a little bit of time and you can get, I think it's a fairly dramatic difference. And of course, if you did it like this and then put a semi-gloss or a matte top coat over the top, you'd get an even more weathered metal look because it wouldn't be quite so shiny, which I think is great. I think that's very nice. I live up to my name of JUNKMECH with my love of making robots look like they just fell in a garbage disposal and then were thrown in a dumpster. However, that is not necessarily for everyone. So you can do it as much or as little as you would like to get a result that you think looks good. And again, this down here, this is just edge highlighting really. Actually apply just a little there. There. So once I get this whole side, some decent progress on it, I'll switch to another tool to show another technique that you can do here. In fact, maybe I won't even wait because this could take a little bit. Like I said, this dry brushing like this is something where you want to take your time on it. So what we'll do So I will grab. There we go. A sponge. And again, all the tools I use for this kind of thing are like as cheap as possible. I think I got these from like Ross in a giant pack of sponges and brushes and stuff. But what you do, and I'm doing it this specific way because it's easy to control how much you put on it. You put it in the top. Do this just to get this sponge to absorb some paint. Then you take it just like you would with a dry brush and you sponge it off so it's a lot more dry. Get a lot of the moisture out of it. And then what you do, make sure this is focused. There we go. Is you just go in and you dab a little bit of silver on spots. You don't want to do too much of this because it does start to look kind of tacky if you do too much. But you get a very distinctive look versus dry brushing just by dabbing on a little silver. It starts to just, again, it's just another method of giving it a more realistic look. I actually find that this specific method with the bright silver dabbed on with a sponge looks best over bright colors because it kind of gives the look of paint that has weathered. But of course, it also looks pretty good on just dark plastic. And I like to use this specific method with the sponge to add a little more depth to big panels. You'll see there, that was actually a little more paint than I wanted. But it'll be okay. It'll dull out and I just won't add more. But you can get some pretty nice subtle effects just by dabbing on a little bit of silver. And again, this is like, I think the total cost of this specific setup is like $12. It's pretty cheap. It's definitely not like airbrushing, which has a much higher barrier of entry and a much higher material cost, specifically for the airbrush itself. Because I have like a, I don't know, $200 airbrush gun. But that's because I'm a spoiled old man. And that's what you get when you're a spoiled old man. Just ask Ridiculous Badger. He knows all about being a spoiled old man.
I resemble that remark.
I mean, I was called 47 in chat the other day, which apparently, I mean, I'm 29. I'm not really that old, but I'm old enough to, you know.
You weren't called 47 because someone thought you were 47. You were called 47 because someone thought that would be an insult.
Oh, that's
right?
fair.
Isn't that how that works?
I mean, I have no idea. I'm not good at online trash talking. Also, by the way, you can kind of just do standard dry brushing with a sponge. It's not really recommended because it's harder to control finely, but you know, whatever. You can do anything you want with this kind of thing. You could even, instead, if you don't have a sponge and you wanted to do this specific type of technique, you could probably get away with a little bit of paper towel held in a ball, and like probably with tweezers, and then tapped on. I think that would get you a similar sort of look. And in fact, once I'm done with this little bit, I will try just that, so we can see. Because I like to, one of the core tenets of this kind of thing when I'm doing videos and stuff is I want to make sure that it's as cheap and accessible as possible to as many people as possible. I try not to gatekeep with this kind of thing because I mean, it's a toy, right? This is all toys. It's just putting a little paint on a toy. It doesn't need to be something that is made esoteric and difficult for unnecessary reasons.
Don't worry, dude. You don't gotta gatekeep. Someone else will handle that all for you.
That's true. I'll let everyone else gatekeep it. If you guys want to gatekeep, I will judge you, but I don't care. You can do what you want. So let's try a little bit of this. I don't know how this will look. I haven't done this in a while. This is the kind of thing I did back in the old days. So like that. I've just got some pointy tweezers, so we'll give this a go. I suspect that it'll work just fine. Let's see, where's a good spot? Yeah, that works just fine. It holds a little more paint than the sponge does, just by its nature. But yeah, I think you still get a pretty comparable sort of look with the balled up paper towel. So if you don't want to have to buy a pack of sponges, but you want the kind of, I don't know how to describe it, the kind of speckled sort of look, you can totally do it with a balled up paper towel. I think that is just fine, and I think that's pretty accessible, especially since in order to dry brush, period, you have to have paper towels. Or I guess you could use a washcloth if you want to ruin a washcloth. But I am not the type to use a washcloth because I have a wife, and my wife would not like it if I threw a washcloth in the dirty clothes that was completely covered in paint. That could go better or worse than than some other choices. But yeah, that was way too much. I mean, it's okay. Like, the thing that I approach this kind of thing with is I'm effectively dirtying the toy. So if I go a little too hard, it kind of doesn't matter. And it also gives you an excuse to, not worry so much about making little mistakes. Like, I know I dipped this end over here, like in the paint or something, because it's just solid. But, on the shelf or on your desk, you won't notice. Like, this stuff is so small that you're not liable to see minor mistakes like that. And again, you could always wash it off if it really is not to your liking. But it's the advantage of dry brushing, I would say, over any other type of weathering is how ridiculously forgivable it is. It's so easy to undo, and if you make like a mistake or you don't like how something looks, it's so easy to just go in and take it off. Just the one thing with like I said, dry brushing is really hard on brushes, and you'll start to lose bristles and stuff. And I find that when you have stray bristles sticking out, it kind of damages the look as it adds big just like splotches here and there. Which, I mean, you could honestly turn that into its own style, but I'm not adventurous. I'm a scared old man. But yeah, this is pretty much. I think this side is more or less done. Let me zoom the camera out slightly. Ooh, I said slightly. Thank you. There we go. So this side is, I would call this pretty much done as far as the dry brushing goes versus a vanilla side. You definitely, I don't know where I got that on there, but you can immediately appreciate the difference. And this is like, I would say this is probably one of the easiest painting techniques, just because all it takes is, holding the brush. I always hold them like kind of at an angle. I don't really brush flat. I always brush at an angle. I don't know why. I don't know if that's better or worse, to be honest. But it's how I'm used to doing it. And that's one of the nice things about it is you can do this stuff kind of however you want. Where's a good spot? I think we'll pick right here. So one other option, and this is going to be one of those things where it's either too much or not, depending on your preferences. What you can do, let me get a little more paint on my brush. You can take it and you start on the top of the panel and you just go around the whole thing like this. You don't push super gently, but you can, fill in an entire panel in kind of I would call it a thick dry brushing style. I think it has its advantages in some contexts, but also I think it tends to look a little bit like too much. The one thing that's nice is on a dark plastic like this, the sort of denser dry brushing really creates, I think, a real metal sort of look. I think it really does look a lot more like actual metal than even, I mean, honestly, this is kind of a backward statement, but I think it kind of looks more like real metal than diecast does, at least because diecast has such a specific look and doesn't really look like the kind of metal you encounter in real life. Like day-to-day life, you don't really find a lot of diecast implements. It's mostly steel and aluminum. And I think you get a pretty metal look. You could headbang to it if you really wanted to, but I don't recommend it. Yeah, so there's a little dry brushing on one side. This has been, what, like 40 minutes, 30 minutes? It doesn't take very long, but at the same time, you need to be patient and take your time on it. Because if you rush, you can tell. Like, you'll be able to tell when you look at it. So this is about half done. So I'd say, like, painting this full gun would probably take me a little over an hour. But you can definitely tell, just from a look at it, that it looks a lot better. And we'll switch, just so I'm not doing the same subject matter the whole time. We'll do the hook. Because I'm going to do the hook a little more drastically. I'm going to weather that more. The hook. This goes... He doesn't hold it, right? It replaces his hand? I haven't seen the movie.
I have not seen the movie. I think it replaces his hand, though.
Okay, I assume it replaces his hand like an animated. So, okay, but this is one of those things. Like, this is going to be compared to a gun, for example. This will be seeing a lot more friction against other pieces of metal as he's hooking them, like Scorpion. So, I think I'll just start with the teeth. I'm going to do specifically the teeth a lot more than the rest of the structure of the hook, because those will be the pieces that are biting in the most, and therefore will give you. Those will be, any paint or coating on this will be stripping off more. So they'll be in the roughest shape. Which is, like I said, I like to... I mean, I don't know if it's dorky or whatever. This is Transformers. But I like to always imagine how this would be being used in context. Like, for example, the fists, the knuckles will be more weathered than the rest of the hand if you want to get that granular. Like, you absolutely do not need to be putting that much thought into it. You can just do this stuff as like a thing that looks good, and it doesn't need to be deeper than that. But yeah, I mean, just a little effort, and it really starts to immediately pop, I think, especially against this dark plastic. And you can dry brush non-metallics. I've actually been thinking of doing a junkie on and doing a bunch of weathering to it, but I might use that for for the dirt wash video, because you want to make that dirty. But yeah, let's see. So what I'm doing now is I'm applying what I would call the base dry brushing, just getting the largest areas done that I know I want weathered the most. And then what I will do is, once that is finished, I will go in with the sponge and add a little more kind of texture and depth. And what I might do, if this dries fast enough, I'll go in and do a second silver coat, and then I'll go in with the gunmetal to add some depth to it, just to kind of illustrate that particular process. Let's see. And like, it's one of these things with the brushing itself. Like, I've done a lot of this over the years, so I think I might make it look slightly easy, but it's almost as easy as it looks. You definitely don't need to be some kind of like brush guru, paint wizard to be able to put a decent looking dry brushing coat on a toy. Because it kind of does a lot of itself. As long as you are managing your paint levels, then you'll be, kind of carried through it just by the actual process. Like the execution will do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. And like I said, I'm going to do quite a bit heavier on this because it's a physical weapon.
Hey, what about like you mentioned that the brushes wear out. How many brushes should people start out with?
I mean, honestly, I just say buy a cheap pack on Amazon. I can try to find, for the workshop channel later, I can try to find the specific listing of miniature brushes that I bought. Like, these are ostensibly for like Warhammer minis, like this guy, which I obviously have not painted. But I've never painted a mini before. The only kind of brush painting I ever do is weathering. But I've gone through, I think half my pack of brushes is gone. And I've been using this specific pack for 3 years, 2-3 years. pretty long time. So you don't need to worry too much about wearing through stuff unless you're trying to pursue a very specific sort of look. Like this brush. Let me get it to focus. There we go. See all my calluses. This brush is pretty shot. Like I would never try to use this for anything more detailed than just this. And also like I mean truthfully, like I don't really clean these all that well. I normally let them sit for a little while and then I'll go in and like rinse the paint out, but that's about as much as I'll do. Like for my nicer brushes that I actually use for kind of like precision detailing, I'm a lot nicer to these. But like I mean, I would honestly say like you can beat the heck out of your brushes if you're just gonna be dry brushing with it. If you get like ultra cheap ones, do I have one laying around? No, I threw them all away. I had like really cheap brushes from the pack that this sponge came from, and those like blew out. Like I think I got like 2 uses out of them, and then the bristles started to fall out because part of the process of dry brushing, you know, you put a decent amount, kind of. There's subtlety to it, but you put a decent amount of force against things while doing it. Like you're pushing the brush against plastic with a little more force than when you would normally be painting. And it just, for really cheap brushes, it will just pull those bristles apart. So if you go ultra cheap, I'd expect you'd probably need, I don't know, 3 or 4 brushes to start. But like the pack on Amazon that I bought had like 12 brushes or something, and I only have used a few of them. So, you know, I think the answer is not very many. Just with the expectation that you might need to replace them if you're comfortable with a specific type of brush. If you're just using super cheap ones and blowing them out, then I think you could have as few or as many as you want and not expect to replace those with the exact same ones.
No, that makes sense, and we'll add a listing to the
Yeah, I like
thing.
to. I will find on Amazon the same or comparable pack of brushes because these ones with the big grip, like this, I think are better. Um, you can use straight brushes. I'm sure I have one laying around somewhere. Yeah. Oh, there we go. That's a good example. This is another one that I use for dry brushing sometimes. This is super like firm and dry, full of dried paint. This is a Tamiya modeling brush, actually. Wow. I didn't realize I've been ruining like halfway decent brushes. But these get a lot of mileage. These ones, the Fire in Me cheapo brushes, I would call this almost too fine for weathering. I actually use this to put paint on New Age bronze face. But this specific sort of pack, I think, like I said, I think it was $12 for like 12 brushes or something, and these have lasted as long as as long as you like, really. And like any sort of miniature brush would get you the kind with the larger handle, which I think is nice just on a functional perspective. Like it's definitely not required. You could use any brush you want. But I like to be able to kind of have a nice firm grip on it, just per preference. This is actually, look at that. You can see through it. It's pinned, but the pins aren't inserted very well, so the plastic is parting in the middle. But I don't care. I don't care to fix it. It's just a hook. There we go. So I think this is a pretty good base dry brush. I missed maybe a little bit down here. There. So we'll go in with the sponge. Again, I will get paint on the lid because not very much of it stays there, which makes it really easy to manage because you're not really getting you're not sticking it in your pot of paint. So you just have a little left in the lid. Of course, the sponges wear out much faster than the brushes. They start to get hard, right? And then the paint stops really sticking to them. And I go through sponges much more quickly. You can use like makeup sponges. I know at one point I borrowed a couple of my wife's makeup sponges to do this kind of thing. She had barely used them anyway, and they're okay. I find that cheaper sponges are a little more. They hold less paint, which actually lends them better to this specific type of technique. And you can see here I actually had way too much paint on there, and I just went in with an unused part of the sponge and kind of wiped it down to pull some of that paint off. As long as it's not fully dry, you can kind of get away with pulling a lot of paint back off of these things with like a sponge. However, because it's mostly dry brushing, there's not a lot of time, which this is an important point, I guess. You don't really have that much time to make a correction without pulling a lot of paint off when you first put it on. Because it is already pretty dry, you're not really putting that much paint on there. So it takes very little time to be fully dry. And once it's fully dry, it becomes a lot more difficult to just like wipe off. Like I find that if I have way too much paint and I'm like, oh no, I'll just like lick the end of my finger and just wipe it off on my finger, because as long as it's just on there, you know, even just a little moisture is enough to pull it partially off. So pretty forgiving, I think, especially compared to stuff like dry or airbrushing, which, oh man, that's one video topic I don't think I'll ever be able to make. It would be so much work. We'd have to provide voiceover in post because you wouldn't be able to hear anything. Maybe someday though. Yeah. So the hook is mostly done, I think. I might go and do a little more of the sponging. Yeah, I missed a side. But pretty quick results. Once I'm done with the sponging part here, I will go in with the titanium or the gunmetal and get a little more contrast, just to add some depth to it. Which is, like I said, it's out of all of this, like obviously the entire act of dry brushing is completely optional, but compared to everything else, I would say that adding depth with a second color pass is the most optional of the optional aspects of it. It's like you can have a great looking finished product, quote unquote, without doing a second pass. It doesn't like it is not required to have a good look to the work you did to do a second pass. But I mean, honestly, I find that it's a little more gratifying if you put in more work. That might just be me, but I don't know. I find it kind of satisfying to do more steps, even if it doesn't really make that big of a difference to the look. There we go. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tear the ends of this off because it's got a lot of paint in it. And the one thing with that is you do want to avoid having super paint covered fingers when you're holding stuff. Otherwise you end up with like, let me see if I can get it to do it. This is not really a good example. But if you grab something with super painty fingers, you'll get fingerprints on it. Which, that is the one thing I would say to avoid. Try to make sure that when whichever hand you're handling your plastic with, try not to get too much paint on your fingertips. Because nothing looks worse on a supposedly, how tall are movie bots? I don't know. They're tall. You know, they're like 25 feet tall. Nothing looks worse than a giant fingerprint on a 20-foot tall robot. So, one thing to avoid. Easy to do though, just don't get paint on your fingers. There we go. So let's see if this will even, like the difference on this will probably have a hard time even showing up on camera. Let's see. No, that you can tell. It definitely dulls the shininess. So like up here, or like up here, we'll do it. What it just results in is kind of a layered, sort of weathered look where you have multiple tones. Which, that's another thing we'll touch on in the dirt wash. That's the thing that really does, is it adds contrast. And I don't know, I think it looks nice. There, see? So it definitely dulls the look to add the gunmetal. And then once that's dry, it will create a lot more contrast. Because they will shine differently. So when you're looking at it in person, and maybe in like a photo, you'll definitely be able to tell the difference there. And yeah, I think it just makes things look a little more quote unquote three-dimensional. In this section here, let me see if I can get it to focus on it. Focus. There we go. Like where I put the silver thickest, you can tell the biggest difference when you add the, come on, focus. There. You can see the biggest difference where the gunmetal was added along here as compared to when it was just straight silver, because that was the section that I had a little too much silver on the sponge. And you can definitely tell there, like here. See, so it kind of eats into the shine on the top just a little. And I think that gives it, it's another way to add a little more dynamic realism to your toy. Like the thing that's nice about this kind of thing is it does create a sort of grounded look to a toy. Like obviously we get stuff like this, and he's, I mean, these are not from the same universe. And I find that it really just sells the, like, this is a real machine robot life form much harder than a big solid colored toy does. Of course, I think there's something to be said for weathered G1 toys, like the look. However, truthfully, I just like to maintain resale value too much on my G1 MPs and stuff to really want to do a weathering pass on them. There you go. So I would call the hook completely finished. Yeah, see, in this case, the gunmetal adds a fleck to the plastic without adding really color, because they're kind of the same tone. Which is good and bad. Like, obviously, it's a lot more subtle. But if you like subtlety, it's a great option. There you go. Can you think of any more questions, Badger?
I'm trying to put together the
The
yeah, the
highlight?
outline. I feel like you hit on really a lot of the stuff. I guess just like a couple of technical ones. Once you've added the dry brushing, once you've done your pass and you're ready to go home now and finish up, any special treatment, any way that you should store it so you don't damage the dry brushing?
I mean, honestly, I'm pretty blasé with how I handle dry brush figures. Like, I think there's kind of a fundamental difference between something that you dry brush and something that you fully paint.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can fish you out from behind
Is
my
it something that,
monitor.
like, once you're done, you could just put it on the shelf and then go
Yeah,
about your
absolutely.
business? Yeah. Okay.
This is a great example. So this guy, this is old now. I did this years ago. There was so much I would do differently now. But this, all of the weathering on it, all the dark. This is the dirt wash, kind of done very sloppily. But there's dry brushing, I think, in the legs. Yeah, inside. None of this was top coated, and I did this probably 3 years ago. And it's held on just fine. Peru Kill, who I've pulled out a couple times, he's been sitting on the shelf since I did the dry brush pass on him a couple months ago. And I mean, it looks the same. Like, once it's fully dry, you kind of get an idea of how lustrous it is and if you need to do a second pass or not. And if you need to do a second pass once it's dry because you want it to be a little more shiny, which I think this is fully dry now. So this is one pass, right? So this is kind of what you'd be looking at. And if you really wanted it to be even shinier, you could go over and do a second color pass on it, just because, like, if you did the edge highlighting again, I think that's the most impactful. It shines through much brighter. But that gives you an idea of what it will look like when it's done. And I mean, you could just slap them on the shelf. I think that the paint might attract dust if you're going to store it without a top coat on it. Like, it would be, I think they get kind of, kind of dusty. But with the specific way that I store all this stuff, like, it doesn't really matter. But yeah, so like the second pass with this will get the edges looking a lot shinier, if that's what you want. But that is one thing to keep in mind, is that, you know, paint will dry and it will lose a little bit of its shine. But once you have it done and you're happy with how you've done it, slap it on the shelf. It's fine. That's my catchphrase. Slap it on the shelf. It's fine. But no, it's fine. Like it'll store all right. Like this guy, Monkey, which this is way too zoomed in to be able to see it. There we go. Monkey. This guy's just been standing on my desk for like, I don't know, a week. And it looks the same. You know, it's exactly how I expected it to stay. So no special storage. Again, just be mindful of like the paint rubbing off with extensive handling, because that can happen. And then yeah, see, this brush is like, let me get that focus. This brush is like super stiff and kind of ruined. I wouldn't try to use this for anything but that. Look at all the paint on my fingers. You know, but it's fine. Like you can get away with not doing any special storage. Like I'm gonna take this probably and just stick it on a shelf because I don't feel like reposing the toy. So this won't get stored anywhere nice. And I don't think it'll look any different in a month or in 3 months or something. I think it'll look exactly the same.
Yeah.
So it tends to hold up well.
So we got a question. What wash
Ooh.
colors would you recommend on lighter or brighter colored plastics?
So with washes, and this actually applies to weathering too. This is a great question. Thank you, Ushkurky or Uskurthy. Forgive me for butchering your name. Generally, to get the best look, you want to do the opposite of what you have. So I did a full dirt wash on him with a couple different colors. On the thighs, I did a much darker wash than I did on the arms, because the darker wash comes through better. Like if you look like at the inside of this leg, this is a great example. The brown comes through much stronger on the lighter plastic. So you really want to be picking the opposite of what you have. So if you're doing a dry brush pass on, say, do I even have a visual example of this? Perfect. This thing. Don't question it. If you were doing a dry brush pass on this, on the white, I would probably use something like the gunmetal, a really dark color. And then on the wash, I would also probably pick something pretty dark. And then on a dark color, Curthy. Gotcha. Curthy it is. That's much easier. Yeah, you basically want to be picking something that will contrast with what you're doing. But also, with specifically washes, you can do what is I think they're called ink washes, where you just do it in black. But you need to be really careful with those, or you will you'll have the end result of a really dark toy if you don't get enough of the paint off. So on the monkey, the darkest I did was a dark brown, a Tamiya brown, mixed with a little bit of black. And even then, it's still fairly subtle. Like it's not blowing anyone's mind with how dark it is or anything. It comes up much better in the photos than the video, but nonetheless, I went a little more subtle on the wash. On the arms, I actually did these, and I did a wash in black on these as well, but it barely comes across on video. You can barely tell. Like, see right there. You can see the color contrast where it's lighter and then it's darker. That's just where the paint settled on the panel. So that kind of thing will net you some decent results, but you can also kind of generically use a brown if you're looking for just dirt. Like you want a dirt wash to make it look like it's filthy. You want Movie 1 Camaro B or something. He was a Camaro. That was his first thing, right? I don't know cars. If you want that sort of like really physically dirty, like unwashed look, a brown wash with a hint of black can get you pretty consistently good results, and will look good on most things. On really dark plastic or dark paint, it will definitely be subtle. But you can always aim for a lighter brown, like a brown with some white rather than black, to get a lighter kind of tan tone. Will still get you that sort of physically dirty look. And then yeah, like if you were say gonna dry brush on something light like this, again I keep coming back to this monkey, but I just did this, so it's fine. The thighs for a lot of these, what I ended up doing just to make it so you could actually see the dry brushing at all. God, it's so hard to get it to focus on. There we go. Is a lot of these I actually went over with black on the edges, and I dry brushed on black, and then I dry brushed on silver to give it a medium to have contrast. Because otherwise, you basically can't see like the light silver on the gray plastic. It just doesn't pop. So you do a black first. And actually, as far as washes go, you can see on the die-cast chest in here, I went in with a really thick black wash and dribbled it into the cracks just to get it to, I don't know, kind of pop against the die-cast metal chest. It was really hard to get the paint to adhere. So this is with a much darker wash than like what I would use on the thigh, for example. I think this is basically pure black with a touch of brown. Well, this is pure brown with a touch of black. And actually, if you look on the back of the head area, you can really see where the wash has settled. And again, this is a lighter plastic with a much darker wash. As compared to what I did on the head for the monkey, which I don't know if you'll even be able to see it, but this is a much lighter wash on a much darker plastic. Let's put that back in there. So yeah, go by contrast. If you really want it to be visible, go opposite of what you're doing. Use light on dark and dark on light. Thank you for the very good question. And yeah, I feel like that's pretty much all there is to impart. Dry brushing is a pretty forgiving medium of weathering. It produces pretty consistent results. The one thing as far as like choosing what to dry brush, things that are really smooth, such as this guy, you're not going to get as nice of a detailed look to it just because there's less detail to pick out. If you were, say, dry brushing like do I own one? A Chug toy, a mainline toy, you'd get pretty consistently good results because they always mold in a lot of surface detail. So things with more molded in detail will have kind of more bombastic results just because there's more to pick out. Like, for example, these thigh pipes would probably pop pretty well with a dark, like a black dry brush over the top. In fact, this whole figure I would probably dry brush a mix of gunmetal and a little bit of flat black onto these really bright parts just to get a nice deep contrast to it. And then on like the dark parts, I would probably still do silver. Just because, again, you want to try to maximize visibility and contrast. As far as like mixing paint, I just do it all in cheap disposable palettes. Let me see if I have one to hand. Like one of these. And I just like pour a little paint in to these and then mix it up. You can still dry brush the same way, just you probably have to top it up if you're doing a long dry brushing session because you'll eat through all the paint. Here we go. But yeah, that's kind of what we're looking at. Here's our paper towel. So as you can see, I do a lot of blotting off. That's kind of to be expected. Like, is that one that I used before? You know, you can definitely, this is actually the remnants of a wash, but you can definitely see that it end up wiping a lot of paint off.
Hey, would this be a good spot for me to end the stream, and then if people want to hang out, jump in, whatever, we could still hang?
Yeah.
Does that work?
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, thanks.
I think we've definitely gone over everything. Sorry.
Yeah, no, you're good. Thanks everyone for joining. We're gonna put this up on the ShowZ Store workshop channel, so you'll have access to that. We'll also put the brushes and paints that JUNKMECH is suggesting, and keep a lookout for round 2, where we'll handle some washes and other topics.